everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that you are all fit and well. Last time we began a two-part study on the fifth judge, Gideon. Today we will conclude our examination of this important judge. If you missed last week's study, I encourage you to go back and listen to that one before listening to this. It's available as a video on the YouTube page, or if you just prefer to read my notes, then you can find them as a PDF on the church's website. Our reading today is taken from Judges chapter 8, and I'll be reading verses 29 to 33. Judges 8, 29 to 33. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now Gideon the son of Joash died at a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Last time we began a two-part examination of judge number 5, Gideon. He is also known as Jerubbaal, and this was a name he earned after he had destroyed the altar to Baal. It means, let Baal plead or contend against him. As I said previously, he is considered to be the greatest judge, and this is reflected in the coverage he receives. Of the 12 judges, his story is the longest and most detailed. We looked in part 1 last week at 3 aspects of his life: his call to serve, his tearing down of his father's altar to Baal, and his testing of God with the fleece. Let me now briefly review some of the key things I said last time. We first met Gideon, the hewer or hacker, threshing wheat in a wine press. The people of Israel had again fallen into the cycle of sin. They were guilty on this occasion of disobeying God. In order to bring them back to their senses and into a right relationship with Him, God had allowed the Midianites to oppress them. This semi-nomadic desert people lived in what is today northwest Saudi Arabia. Their particular form of oppression was interesting. Rather than trying to attack and conquer the land militarily, they were content to continually raid Israel. Using their camels, they would attack, steal the crops or livestock, destroy what remained, and then leave. This had been going on for 7 years when we first meet Gideon. The reason that he was threshing wheat in the winepress was to hide what he was doing from the Midianites. It is whilst threshing that he is visited by the Lord Jesus. Jesus tells him that he is a mighty man of valour. And this was news to Gideon, who considered himself to be far from a mighty man. But Jesus, of course, knew what Gideon would later become. His first act was to take place close to home. His father, along with the other residents of Ophrah, had set up an altar and a statue to Baal. Baal was the Canaanite god of fertility. Gideon was ordered to tear down the altar and to chop down the statue. Despite his fear at what the people would think, Gideon went at night and destroyed the place of worship to this pagan idol. He then replaced this abomination with an altar to the one true God. His next mighty act would be a military one. A large force of Midianites, supported by the Amalekites, had crossed the Jordan River and were camped in the valley of Jezreel. Gideon, filled with the Holy Spirit, was told to summon and prepare the troops. Soon he is surrounded by 32,000 warriors, ready and prepared for action. But it's at this point that Gideon begins to doubt himself. He questions God as to whether he really is the right man to lead the people. In order to assure himself, he devises the fleece test. If God agrees to the test conditions, he will be sure that he is the right man. God consents to the test, and Gideon now knows that he is God's choice and that God is on his side. Today we will consider 3 events in the life of Gideon: the battle with the Midianites, Gideon's ephod, and the death of Gideon. The battle with the Midianites. Last time we concluded with Gideon testing God with the fleece. God consented to do as Gideon asked, and he was assured that he was the man to lead the army of Israel. The story of the battle is laid out for us in Judges chapter 7. Now, I won't have time to cover every detail of the story here, so I encourage you to go and read it for yourself. But let me give you the abridged version. Gideon led his force of 32,000 men to the well of Hadad, where they camp. Now, this may seem to us like a large army, but we should bear in mind that the Midianite forces numbered around 132,000 men. It's whilst they are camped here that God again speaks to Gideon. He tells him that he has too many men. God's concern is that when they are victorious, they will ascribe the victory to their own strength and prowess, and they will not see God's hand in it. Therefore, a 2-stage sifting process was needed. For the first stage, Gideon asked any of the men who were fearful if they wished to leave. And it was actually a Mosaic law that we can read about in Deuteronomy chapter 20 verse 8, that the fearful should not be compelled to fight. But probably Gideon was shocked when 22,000 of the men left and went home. God determined that this number was still too big. The second sifting involved asking the men to drink from the water. It is most common perhaps in this kind of situation to kneel down to drink, and this was what 7,700 of the men did. The less obvious way is to scoop up the water and drink it from cupped hands, and this was what 300 of the men did. God selected the 300 cupped hand drinkers. Well, what was the significance of this particular way of drinking? Well, it's not given to us. Therefore, any reasoning why God chose these particular men would just be pure speculation. Let's leave it by just saying that God, of course, always knows best. It was at this same very night that again Gideon seems to have had doubts. From a human perspective, we can perhaps understand why. Why had God dismissed most of the army? How could 300 men defeat 132,000 men? The Lord reassured Gideon by sending him down into the Midianite camp. Here he overhears 2 soldiers discussing a dream that one of the men had had. The dream is interpreted by the other as meaning that the Midianite camp will fall to Gideon and his men. Gideon is freshly reassured and returns to his camp. It's now time for the attack to begin. Gideon divides his 300 men into 3 companies of 100. Each man is given a pitcher that contained a torch, and he was told to hold this in his left hand. In his right hand he held a trumpet. Now, I made a point of saying what was in each man's hand to emphasize what was not in their hands. You see, they carried no weapons, and this would highlight that this was God's victory. The men surround the camp at midnight, and on Gideon's signal blew the trumpets and smashed the pitchers. We can only imagine the shock and terror felt by the Midianites. One minute they were sleeping soundly, and the next, here comes this terrible noise. In their terror and confusion, they end up fighting one another and fleeing into the night. God had done what he had promised, and Gideon and his men were victorious. Let's now move on to an incident that happens towards the end of Gideon's life. Gideon's ephod. It took some time to fully drive out the Midianites. To do so, Gideon had to call for help from some of the surrounding tribes. One of the tribes that he neglected to call up to help was Ephraim, and they were put out by this snub, and Gideon had to diplomatically get them back on side. He also had some issues with the men of Succoth and Penuel. They obviously doubted Gideon's ability to defeat the Midianites and refused him support and hospitality. Gideon remembered this And when the Midianites had been crushed, he returned to hack down the men of Succoth and Penuel. We may today look on this act as being somewhat cruel and tyrannical, but we should remember that the men of Succoth and Penuel had willfully rejected God's chosen leader. They were rebelling against God, and in not supporting Gideon, they were actually helping the enemy. As a judge, it fell upon Gideon to act justly against them. When Gideon returns home, it is to something of a hero's welcome. The people come together and ask him to be their king and ruler. Gideon answers them very wisely by reminding them that God is their king and ruler. But what happens next is rather puzzling. Despite rejecting their offer to be king, Gideon lives and acts in very much the way that a king would. He appears to live a life of luxury and has many wives. He even names one of his sons Abimelech, which means, "My father is a king." Sadly, he will also lead the people into idolatry. The Midianites wore gold crescents, either in their nose or ear, and these would be taken as the spoils of war. And the people of Israel had collected a large quantity of these. Gideon requests that the people give him their gold, and he collects approximately 22 kilograms of it. With this gold, he makes an ephod. We are not told why he decided to do this. Perhaps he intended it to be something for him alone to enjoy, or maybe it was intended as a memorial to their great victory. There is also some debate regarding exactly what this particular ephod was. It may have been fashioned after the vest-like garment worn by the high priest. It might have been a replica of the priestly ephod, made completely out of gold. Or it may have been a statue or a freestanding image. Whatever the case, it became a snare to both Gideon and to the people. They, we are told, played the harlot with it. This means that they worshipped it as an idol, or used it in the worship of another pagan god. Although Gideon, of course, had not intended the ephod to be used in this way, its existence led the people to fall away from God. Let us then conclude our study of Gideon by looking at the very end of his life. Verse 32. Now Gideon the son of Joash died at a good old age, and was bedded in the tomb of Joash his father, in Ophrah of the Abizarites. Gideon and the people of Israel would enjoy 40 years of peace or rest. Gideon lived a good life until old age. He accumulated many wives and had 70 sons. This, of course, was not God's will, and was in fact the way that pagan kings tended to live. He also kept a concubine in Shechem, who bore him his son Abimelech. Later this son will go on to be the cause of great trouble and strife. When Gideon died, he was bedded in his father's tomb. Following this, the people lived in willing, joyful obedience to God. Sadly, of course, that was not what happened. Verse 33. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, and made Baal-berith their god. No sooner had Gideon died than the people again fell into idolatry. They once again sought to replace the one true God with a pagan substitute. I suppose we might ask why it was that Israel repeatedly fell into this pattern. Why not just resist these urges and focus solely on God? The answer is that worshipping pagan gods was what everyone else was doing. It was just the normal thing in the ancient world. When other people were following these simple, convenient, and logical methods of worship and having success, well, why not just copy them? In this case, they elected to worship Baal-berith, which means Baal, Lord of the Covenant. Verse 34. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. Most of us enjoy a story with a happy ending. Sadly, however, the story of Gideon ends in great sadness. Again, we see the people forgetting all that God had done for them. How quickly they forgot about how he gave them a famous victory over their enemies. Not only did they forget God, but they also forgot Gideon and his family. His family went from being respected and honored to being forgotten and ignored. It's very important that we recognize and remember the service that people have done. And this is why, of course, we have memorial days and statues that commemorate people's rich achievements. An assessment of Gideon. As we stand back and look at the life of Gideon, what are we to make of him? I think we would have to conclude that he was far from being the perfect hero. At times he showed timidity and fear, and his faith was lacking on a number of occasions. In his latter years he gave in to lust and sought in some ways to live the life of a king. His bad decisions in making a golden ephod and in having a concubine led to serious trouble. But it's these weaknesses of character that make Gideon so relatable. He is, if you like, a common everyday kind of hero, and in him we see elements of ourselves. At times we too lack faith. We too are at times unable to relate properly to God, and we are far too often led by our greed and selfish desires. However, we should also note that his failings as a man meant that what God accomplished through him is even more remarkable. God used this flawed man to bring an end to Baal worship for a time. God also empowered him to lead the people to a mighty victory. Both of these acts took courage and a dependence upon God. So Gideon was flawed, but a hero nevertheless. Let me end with how he is remembered in Scripture. I'm reading here from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 to 35. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Things to think about. I have 2 comments to make from today's passage. Number 1, playing the harlot. The people of Israel repeatedly throughout the book of Judges fell into idolatry. The Bible on a number of occasions refers to this practice as playing the harlot. Simply put, this term refers to spiritual prostitution, and it describes a situation in which a person has divided his devotion among many objects of worship. In Israel's case, they didn't want to rely only upon God. They thought it wise or prudent to also worship other pagan gods. The reason that God hates this practice is because the adoration and worship that should be his alone is shared. It also shows him that his people are not reliant upon him alone. They demonstrate their doubt in his ability to do things. And I would argue that the same thing goes on today amongst many people professing to be Christians. We might not be worshipping other gods, but we are relying on things other than God. We may be relying on our wealth, our education, or our material possessions. So let us look carefully at our lives and seek out areas of idolatry. Let us not condemn the people of Israel when idolatry exists in our own lives. Number 2, short memories. Gideon's story does not have a happy ending. He led the people into 40 years of peace, but when he died, he left no lasting legacy. The people soon reverted to their evil ways and forgot all that God had done. And in so many ways we are exactly the same. How quickly do we forget that God answered our prayers? How soon does it slip from our mind about how blessed we are? No sooner does something bad or negative happen, and we revert to thinking that God has forgotten or is ignoring us. I think there is great value in keeping a record of God's answered prayers. You could keep a journal, or these days make a record on your smartphone. Then whenever you fall away from God or experience a moment of doubt, you can look at this record. You can see all of the times that God loved you and answered your prayers. God truly loves and cares for his precious children. Let us never forget this truth.
Now the men of Ephraim said to him,
"Why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites?"
And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them,
"What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeeb, and what was I able to do in comparison with you?"
Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. When Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted but still in pursuit. Then he said to the men of Succoth,
"Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted. And I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian."
And the leaders of Succoth said,
Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?
"For this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars."
Then he went up from there to Penuel, and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. So he also spoke to the men of Penuel.
"When I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower."
Now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east. For 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them, and he took the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle, from the ascent of Heres. And he caught a young man of the men of Succoth, and interrogated him. And he wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. Then he came to the men of Succoth and said,
"Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, 'Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men?'
And he took the elders of the city, and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. Then he tore down the tower of Penuel, and killed the men of the city. And he said to Zebah and Zalmunna,
What kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor?
As you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king.
They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you.
And he said to Jether, his firstborn,
Rise, kill them.
But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. So Zebah and Zalmunna said,
Rise yourself and kill us, for as a man is, so is his strength.
So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon,
"Rule over us, both you and your son, and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian."
I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. I would like to make a request of you, that each of you would give me the earrings from his plunder.
for they had golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. So they answered,
"We will gladly give them."
and they spread out a garment, and each man threw into it the earrings from his plunder. Now the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camels' necks. Then Gideon made it into an ephod, and set it up in his city Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more. And the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons, who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father, in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel.